why am I going to talk about I-18N? Instead of talking about something more interesting and hot topics such as like performance, better DX, accessibilities, you name it. Well, there are actually like a couple of outstanding and interesting numbers and statistics that I wanted to share with you so that we all can learn about the state of the internationalization. Also, not just only giving you the information in general, I also wanted to, like make the point in my talk that by knowing more approaches and also knowing more options would give you to, like be able to select the best DX for your cases. Let's move on to the next slide. And it's little things about me. My name is Arisa. I'm originally from Japan, but I live in Germany right now. And I work as a developer relations engineer at Storyblok. We have a booth over there, so make sure to try to like join the raffle to win the nice Lego sets. And I'm happy to talk with you, like around the booth or like anything in general during the conference. So besides from my work, I'm an ambassador at Girl Code, and I'm a GDE in web technologies. So before I start to talk about what I'm here for, there are 3 takeaways from my talk. So first of all, we're going to see the impact of the I-18N. And secondly, we're going to see the fundamental logics, how the internationalization would work. And lastly, we're going to see how remix and I-18N works. There are a couple of notes that I want you to keep in your mind because there are still really active ongoing discussions when it's like about the remix and internationalization features. And I want you to keep in your mind that the approaches or some of the options that I'm going to show you in this talk is not the best or something that I want to push you to use it. That's just one of the examples. But who knows? You could be one of the, one of them to contribute to make the experience better. So if you're interested in to join the discussions, here's the link that you can have a look at it. And later on my talk, I'm going to share my slides on Twitter. So I-18N is, first of all, is an acronym that I was keep saying, like coming from actually the internationalization. And when I was creating this talk, I started to think, like in my mind, why there's not so much, like active discussions going on in our community. Is it because the DX for developers are not the best? Or is it simply like something people didn't want to have or like not highly demanded feature to implement? So to narrow down what I was like wondering about, like in my mind, I started to, like ask in the communities or friends who I know. So to start it, I, like asked this question on Twitter by saying, do you like to implement the internationalization logic? And not so many numbers that I was able to get, but luckily I was able to get a couple of volunteers and friends, like answering me to give me their experience about that. So based on their experiences, I could tell like nearly like 50% of them are not fully enjoying the DX when it comes to implementing the internationalization. I know it's not all about, let's say, the informations that we all can 100% can confirm and take it, but it's already good enough element to realize that maybe the DX around implementing the internationalization could be something, like one of the reasons why the developers out there are not actively having the discussions. So I came up with another, like kind of question, asking like maybe their DX around implementing the internationalization is not good. So there's one friend of mine, Maya. She also shared with me more, let's say like her experience in depth. And she told me there is the cost to learn things again when it comes to using the I-18N library every single time. Imagine every single time you need to consume this much amount of the time and your work. So of course it would probably like end up having the not the nicest experience when it comes to implementing the internationalization. And also she also stated that there is an issue of when it comes to test the values between, the key values in between localized text and the I18N keys are not matching. So now we know more, generally speaking, like what I was able to reach out to, like my friends out there or the communities out there, and also hearing like what exactly let's say their DX around the internationalization is bothering them. So now we could kind of say, seems it's not the best DX around there. So based on what we were able to kind of see a little peek about why it's bothering, let's say, developers for not actively discussing about the I18N, let's have a look at some numbers and the statistics, because we also want to have general knowledge about what's going on and the state of the I18N. I would like to start to talk about something big numbers. So let's start to talk about billions. The reason why I came up with this idea is because the numbers would actually give you like really nice visualized information. How many users in our world are actually consuming the content in English or non-English content. So this billions of the numbers of the users, 5.07 billions of the users, are actually the numbers of the users in the world use the internet. And let's break down these billions of numbers of the users into some percentages. Starting from something small, so this 25.9% actually stands for the English content on the internet. So this really gave me a surprise that more than I thought, the English content on the internet is way less than I thought. And if you're probably good at in math, you could reach out and calculate this amount of the number, but I'm not gonna give you the pressure to do. So this is the number of the percentage of the users who access the non-English content on the internet. So if you pay kind of close attention to my first slide, which was saying let them, access over 70% of the users in the world to your application is not a lie. It's based on the statistics. And based on these, bigger numbers, now we can come up with this keyword, China. It's because China has the most internet users worldwide. And no surprise, another keyword, Asia. Yes, Asia leads more than a half of the global internet users out there. More than a half of a global, more than a half of the world of the users. And that's two huge numbers to ignore. But I'm not in a position to give you such a great pressure that, based on the DX around the I18N is maybe not the best at this point, but you still need to, deal with this huge demand of implementing the internationalization. But instead, I'm more in the position, or I prefer to be in more of a position to tell by knowing the different approaches, or as many as approaches, this will give you some solutions to find the best DX when it comes to implementing the internationalization. So now let's move on to talk about the fundamental logic. So there are three ways to determine the languages and the regions. And the first option is simply detecting the location from the IP address of the users. But personally, I wouldn't recommend going just to use this approach, because simply users like me who live in, let's say, a foreign country where I was not born and do not speak the language in there, fluently, because my German is really not good. I don't want to see the content every single time, in German. So that's why there are a couple of other backups to help determine the languages and the regions. So the second one is actually, in a way, to respect what users configured on their browsers to see the content. And the last approach is creating the identifiers in the URL. So in this, let's say my talk, we are going to use two ways to go hybrid. And I'm going to show you more details what exactly mean by that to say creating the identifiers in the URL with the 3 patterns. So pattern 1, this is simply a way to differentiate by domains. But again, I don't recommend you going with this way, because first of all, it's not going to follow the same origin policy. And here's the pattern 2. This approach would look kind of nice for developers, but let's say like for users who do not have the technical backgrounds, for them, imagine if you're going to end up, like adding up many more URL parameters, it's going to look quite chaos. So that's not user-friendly. So here's the pattern 3. This approach would allow users to have a user-friendly, like view of the URL, as well as you can localize the URL. So your users would be able to understand which kind of localized content they're taking a look at it. And from the developer's perspective, from the UI, you actually can implement the options for the users to switch back and forth, like by letting them to have their own, let's say, like control to change the localized content. So next up, let's talk about the frameworks and the libraries. But why suddenly out of nowhere I start to talk about the frameworks and the libraries? Well, it's not just because I just feel like talk about it. It's actually because some of the frameworks and the library, they use the I18N frameworks. And let's see how it works in Remix. And there are, in general, 2 approaches to choose. And again, these are not the only solutions out there, so I highly recommend you to go have a look at and do your own research and find the best options for you. So we're going to have a look at these examples as one of the examples. So first of all, like there's a way to install an NPM package, and the other approach is to use together with the content management system. So an NPM package, what I was mentioning about, is called Remix I18 Next. And we're going to see together this example first. To get started, we can start to create the 2 translation files to have the one default language and one translated another language. So the default language I set as in English, and the other language, which I translate into another language, I set as in Japanese. Next up, we are going to create an I18 Next configuration file. And what is important about this config file is that we set the supported languages value, as well as the fallback language value, and then we define the default namespace. The reason why I was able to already, like give a name to the default namespace like this is because in the previous slide, that's where I was giving this name. So just a little information for you. Moving on to the I18 Next the server.js file. Based on what we have configured, we import this I18 Next configuration file in here and calling the supported languages as well as the fallback languages. And the rest of the stuff, what I'm doing in the bottom, kind of 2 lines in the bottom, is that I'm iterating the values that we configure from the I18 Next configuration file, because the values we define are arrays and the strings. That's why I can iterate them. And the last thing what I'm doing is to defining the paths for the translation files. So now moving on to create the client-side and the server-side configuration files. But because of the time I have right now, which is like 5 minutes and a few seconds, I'm only going to, like show you the client side, because server-side file would look pretty much similar. So to prevent like duplications, I'm only going to pay attention to the client side. So here's the server.client.jsx file. What I want you to pay attention is only 3 lines of the code. So first one, which is highlighted in orange background, is an API called I18 Next Provider. So with this API, we wrap another component called Remix Browser. So there are two things what I'm doing in this file. First of all, I'm waiting to ensure the translations are loaded before the hydration happens. And why does the hydration matter? I'm going to show you the reasons with a couple of examples in one of the following up slides. And the second thing what I'm doing is wrapping this Remix browser component in IAT Next provider. So again, we're going to see why together in one of the next slides. So first, why? Why precisely the translation, should be loaded before the hydration happens? Or even better to ask this way: why the hydration does matter when it comes to loading the translations? So let's imagine this example. If in your application the translation is not loaded before the hydration happens, your users come to your application, but your application is not yet interactive. Means that you fake the interface, but behind the scene is not yet ready. So when the users click the Japanese option on the UI, they wouldn't be able to see what it should be, localize the content. And let's imagine another example. If the translation is already loaded before the hydration happened, then your application is fully interactive. That's why you just don't fake the interface, but in the behind the scenes, everything is prepared. So whenever your users, click to have a look at the content in localized, languages, it's ready. Moving on to the second why, from what I was showing you, the source code. Why wrapping Remix browser component with IAT Next provider? I would like to search, finding what is actually, mean by that in more in depth. So I went up to have a look at in the node modules, and here's what I was able to find where this IAT Next provider has been defined. So it turned out that they use Mimo, which is a React hook, and what they're using this use Mimo is to prevent triggering the unnecessary re-rendering. So what I mean by that to say is, I hope you can see my cursor. So if the value of the IATN configuration and the value of the default namespaces are the same, then why not to save the energy? We don't need to trigger unnecessary re-rendering. But if one of the values or both of the values are updated, then that's the only time we are going to consume our energy to trigger the re-rendering. So now let's use all the configurations we have defined so far in action. So go into your Remix application and open up your root.jsx file. Here you have the 3 important APIs that I want you to pay attention. What I really like about the Remix is they do not, overwhelm you by providing so many bunch of numbers of the APIs that you need to study from scratch, but instead they provide the right amount of the APIs, and all of them would work quite simple but efficient and good functionalities. So here's the loader function that is actually a backend API, which is already connected to the use loader loader data. So this use loader data gets the locale from the loader function. And in the end, what I'm doing is instead of defining the new response headers, etc., which would consume up to minimum 4 to 5 lines of the code, I can just do the same thing in one-liner ish code by calling this JSON API. And what I'm doing in the end in here, which is called use change language function, is that this function updates the I18N instance language to the current locale from the loader. So the locale will be updated at this point, and I18Next will load the correct translation files. So we have a literally any route of your, let's say, file. You can import another API called use translation from React I18Next. There's a little heads up for you, because now you see the new NPM package name called React I18Next. It is because in this approach, you might need to install a couple of additional, packages. So that's why we're going to see another example, which is the combination with the content management system. So what I'm doing is calling the key values that I have set in the very beginning of this example greeting. So now you can see, like on the browser, the languages has been switched back and forth. In this case, Spanish and English. But if you have paid attention very closely around the URL, you saw a sneaky little glitch going on. So that's why I need to be quite honest with you that I have 3 confessions. No shame, but I use the URL parameters, but it's not fun. And that's something I precisely stated in the beginning that I wanted to avoid using it. And secondly, do we developers need to actually maintain the translation files? Unfortunately, yes, as you saw in the beginning, we define the translation files. So last thing, do we translate the slugs? No, I don't think so. So we have a couple of more works to do. First of all, we are going to localize the URL, and we don't want to maintain any translation files in the source code level. So let's get this done by going to having a look at this content management system example. I'm now going to use my time, the rest of my time, to show how you can connect with your choice of the headless CMSs and your Remix application. Instead, you can just scan this QR code, and you can read our 5 minutes tutorial if you would like. And in this example, I use the story block because with this option, you can choose between 4 approaches to design how you want to implement the internationalization. And if you're interested in have a look at the examples of the rest of the 3 approaches that I kind of grayed out, feel free to talk to me during the Remix Conf. I'm going to be around, at our booth or watching the talk, so feel free to talk to me. And in this talk, I'm going to show you the folder level translation example. As you can see in the screen, you can see the localized content has been divided into the different dedicated folders, so that your content editors and the translators, they're not going to mix up where they need to work. And let's have a look at how it's going to work in the browser before we're going to talk about the logic, how we can implement to get done the rest of the tasks that I was talking before. So in the let's say the root where you can see all the blog overview in the default language, you can see there's no, I would say locale slug has been added, but when you go to a blog post article called Traveling to Salt Lake City in Japanese, now I think you can see the Japanese locale has been added into the URL. So at this point, you were able to translate the URLs for the users. And when you go back to the blog overview in Japanese, again, you see the JA, which stands for the Japanese slug, is there. And when you go to the home in default language, you shouldn't see any slug has been added, because simply for the default language, you don't want to add any additional slugs in the URL. So we saw, first of all, how it should work as a final result. And to enable such features, what we are going to use is the splat that is actually provided from the Remix side. And what I, again, really like about the Remix is the way to get or fetch all the full slugs are very easy, because you don't need to prepare something from scratch by yourself. In the source code, I'm just going to skip, let's say, the APIs that we already covered together, such as use loader data and the JSON. We already know how it works. So let's just pay attention to the one line of the code where I highlighted with the green background. So there's a special parameter called params with the square brackets and the string values with the asterisk. Honestly, if you set this, special parameter inside of the console.log, and going back and forth in between different, pages on the browser, then you'll be able to see or get the full slugs of wherever you're going to go. So that's it actually, and just a few modifications if you want to, let's say remove when you're at the very root of the home page, something like that. But without, doing any hard work on your end, you can actually, modify you can actually get the full slides on the fly and can modify the path as you want. So here's a summary of my talk. First of all, we saw outstanding numbers and the statistics, and now we know that more than half of the users in the world access the localized content. And secondly, this is the main point of my talk. By knowing more approaches would help you to find a better DX for your case before you start to implement the internationalization, so that you don't have to suffer later. And lastly, in the beginning of the talk, I was asking you the question, why am I going to talk about internationalization instead of talking about something more attractive or considered as the hot topics? But now we all know that it does matter for the performance. It also does matter for the UI and UX and many more. And that's it about my talk. I hope you enjoyed my talk, and I'm so happy that finally it went well. Thank you so much for watching my talk, and let's enjoy the Remix Conf.